Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a series of lectures on the Sun, our star. My name is Jean-Guillaume RICHARD. The title of the work that I will be discussing and introducing throughout this series is as follows: The Fivefold Sun. We are on October 2nd in the year 2018. This work, which consists of 15 volumes, this is volume 1 of part 1, for instance, and this is volume 2 of part 1. There are, as I said, in all 15 of these, about 6,000 pages. They were filed at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, the French National Library, in late 2017. We are now about a year later, and I have now the time to introduce this long piece of work in the form of a series of videos. This is the first such video. It deals with the introduction to this entire topic. And in the introduction, I wanted to start with thanks to the many people who helped me in this endeavor. These are mostly solar physicists like Kalevi Mosula, who is the organizer of the Space Climate Conference in Oulu, where he was so kind to invite me in 2013. My personal trajectory in the field of solar physics started with my first paper, which was submitted in 2002, the H-Faber cycle pulsation, published by Solar Physics in the journal Solar Physics in the year 2004. And the second and last publication that I also was able to put forth was a collective one in 2016, Vaquero et al., a new collection of sunspot group numbers, which is a data paper, jointly with Frédéric Klett, who is the head of the Astronomical Union's World Data Center for Solar Data in Brussels, Leif Svalgaard of Stanford University, the well-known solar physics expert, and José Vaquero and others. I also thank a number of French-speaking solar scientists because French is my own mother tongue. I also wanted, in the introduction to this work, to thank a number of observers of the Sun who in earlier times contributed to the basics of our knowledge of this star. These are the giants on the shoulders of whom we are standing today, starting with Thomas Harriot, who in 1610 first was able to sketch these features that are the testimony of solar activity behavior, the so-called sunspots. There are a number of other scientists that I list here. I name today only Schwabe, who discovered the 11-year cycle but called it an about 10-year cycle, whereas Wolf later proposed that it was a cycle of 11.11 years. And Richard Carrington, who in England, also in the mid-19th century, was able to investigate for the first time in detail the latitudinal and in general the spatial distribution of those sunspots, which are the tracers of solar activity. But they are not the only tracers, and unfortunately some other contributors to a thorough definition of what is the cyclic activity of the Sun are now almost forgotten, such as Heinrich Weber, this German amateur, so-called amateur, who discovered the faculae on the Sun's polar regions. I also wanted to mention the mathematicians who advanced the theory of symmetry in solids, which is in my project related to the presence of a suggested fivefold symmetry in the solar ball. Of course, this starts with the Greeks, Hippasos and Plato, through Fibonacci, who discovered a arithmetic presence of a fivefold symmetry, to Kepler, who first made a bridge between the numbers sequence of Fibonacci, who represent a numerical manifestation of fivefold symmetry, and the solid body fivefold symmetry of the icosahedron and of the dodecahedron. Coxeter, closer to us, was able, after Felix Klein, to elaborate on this bridge through group theory and number theory, the bridge between numbers and space structures, which verifies, in general, fivefold symmetry. The field is still now advancing in the contemporary times, as witnessed by, for example, the work of Yann Bugeaud, who recently, in the last 10 years, was able to find the proofs of several important properties of Fibonacci numbers. There is in the introduction to this work an index of biographical notes, which I included in these pages in honor of those who I found on my way to assembling as much as possible of the important knowledge that exists on the Sun. Again, Schweibe, Carrington, Babcock, but closer to us also Parker. They each have their own notice, biographical notice, which I put together in this work, as well as notices for the mathematicians that I mentioned, including Felix Klein, after Plato, which is also discussed, but also more less well-known recent investigators, such as the set of women who, I don't know exactly what the reason is, were the leading investigators of the longitudinal distribution of solar activity, as opposed to, say, the radial distribution or the latitudinal distribution of solar activity. There are also some biographical notices in this work about historians of the solar cycle, which are not necessarily astronomers who observed with telescopes. Derek Chauvet is a London-based historian of the long-term solar cycle, for which I wrote a biographical note. Paul Damon and Charles Sonnet are indirectly historians of the solar cycle in the long run, because they found the methodologies to interpret the radiocarbon record, which allows us to reconstruct solar activity in the very distant past, at the millennial scale at the least. Also in this introduction there is a methodological section which is devoted to the main technique, statistical technique that I implemented to arrive at the conclusion that are reached in this work. This technique is meta-analysis. Meta-study or meta-analysis is one of the several methods of this investigation, but it is the most important one. And it rests on as large a set as possible of diverse observations of the Sun, and only of the Sun. I stress this point in the introduction, although it may be not so obvious to restrict the set of observations that will help understand the Sun to the Sun itself, because I have found that many astrophysicists who dealt with the Sun have relied on facts that were observed at Earth and were found not to be relevant to the workings of the Sun, not to say the physics of the Sun. So I restrict the set of the meta-study to only observations of the Sun and exclude anything that is geocentric or that is geophysical. The notion of meta-study, as you know, comes from the medical sciences and the social sciences, especially epidemiology, because of the need to arrive at statistical results in these sciences which deal with human populations and large numbers. They are being applied to physical matters only to a limited extent, because in general in physics, especially if you deal with the stars that can be observed, there are a few of them that can be observed in detail, you have small numbers of objects, and the statistical necessities are less than for human populations. So it is a small innovation here to have relied on meta-analysis in the field of solar physics to such large extent. I cite in the introduction to this work a few words from these very important people on the shoulders of whom we are standing, such as Darwin and Kepler, about documentation. Because if we deal with research based on meta-analysis, of course, documentation, data are the crux of the matter. And I cite Darwin, who said that he believed there is an innumerable set of well-observed facts which are stored in the minds of naturalists, and they are ready to be used and to compose a synthetic picture of what is being investigated. But if you do not consider this entire set from the many observers that have been finding results over time, you will not be representing the entire reality. And that's why he said, my activity, my industry has been as great as I could in the observation and the collection of facts. And we shall try, at least I tried in this work, to follow this good advice, this good piece of advice. Kepler, who obviously worked a few centuries before Darwin, was not less strict in his concern with focusing on facts. He said, what we need is harder work, we need tranquility, we need concentration, and when we reach that point, we will finally perceive the whole world with the great precision that is required. He also said we will be flooded with incredible pleasure when we reach that high point. And before we leave the introduction to the Fivefold Sun, as I called this work, I would cite Rudolf Wolf, who is, after all, the father of solar statistics, if not the father of the solar cycle, which was invented by by Schwabe sometime before. He said he was not a genius. Rudolf Wolff claimed he was not a genius, but he worked so hard that in fact he founded the science of the solar cycle, and that's what we are going to deal with now in the next lectures. These lectures are spread in 16 different videos, which cover 6 different parts, which together amount to this 15-year research that I performed. The first part deals with a numerical kinematic of the solar cycle. It deals with the length of the solar cycle and its legs, regarded as multiples of the solar rotation. This is an innovation, and it brings some interesting results. Then in part 2, the 3D constitution of the solar ball is investigated in light of the results of the first part. We shall see that this is where fivefold spatial symmetry can be suggested in the Sun. In part 3, we deal with the changes in the interior of the solar ball across the solar cycle, but this is really a small attempt which did not bring much fruit. In the fourth part, we deal again with time approach of solar behavior, and we try to define bounds to the solar cycle, which means lengths of the solar cycle that are characteristic of its behavior that are longer than about 10 to 11 years, and other cycles that are also statistically characteristic and are shorter than 10 to 11 years. And we shall see that there is a correspondence between the possible constitution of the interior of the solar ball when it is about 11 years long and when it is less or more long. In part 5, we deal with oscillations that are beyond or shorter, much shorter than the solar cycle of 10 to 11 years. These may be up to 1,000-year or several thousand-year long oscillations, or shorter oscillations that are only a few rotations of the Sun long. We shall see that there is a number of distinct kinds of such oscillations, which may be multiples, integral multiples of the quasi-decadal solar cycle, or may not be integral multiples of this cycle. And finally, in part 6, we will deal with the solar surface, and we will have here 2 parts, one dealing with the distribution of solar cells, and we'll find that there is a unique cascade of solar cell sizes at the solar surface that covers the solar surface in a complete way. And we shall see that, on the other hand, there is a certain distribution of magnetic structures, the sunspot groups, and the magnetic bipoles, that also verifies fivefold symmetry in the plane, in the spherical plane at the solar surface, and this warrants a 16th volume for the end of this work. Thank you for your attention, and please now open the next video, which deals with the first volume of part 1, numerical kinematic of the Sun. How long is the solar cycle in terms of solar rotations? Thank you for your attention.